On August 3rd, NASA held a press conference where they announced the astronauts who would be flying on the first 4 flights of its commercial crew program. And this was a day of a lot of firsts. It's the first time a private contractor and not a government itself will be responsible for sending humans into space. We've got Boeing's first astronaut who will be flying, and the first time the maiden crew of a new spacecraft will include a woman. But most importantly, this is the first time since 2016 where I got to see Ted Cruz making that face where he looks like he doesn't understand anything that's going on, but you can't actually tell if he doesn't understand anything, because that's also just his default expression. But actually, most importantly, space travel is kind of relevant in the news and will be for a little bit, and since this video is tangentially related to that, I could put it in the tags and get more views. So, minute-long tangent aside, hello everyone, I'm Luxon. This is a video about Xenoblade Chronicles X. I will be spoiling all of Xenoblade Chronicles X, so we're going to talk about the Skell flight module, how it could be construed to be a plot hole, and how it actually isn't a plot hole. So, video games. When you first get your Skell license, none of the Skells you have can actually fly. They can only jump really high, and it takes Lyn to finish the flight module for any Skell you can possibly get to fly, and of course after that all the ones you have are retrofitted with it so they can all fly. But the weird thing about that is, Earth-made Skells are the only ones that seem to have the problem of not having a functioning flight module. All the alien-made Skells, and by that I mean the 2 Rothian models we see as well as the many different ganglion ones, seem to be able to fly no problem with no flight module required at all. In fact, you're actually required to see a ganglion-made Skell fly before you even have the ability to get the Skell license for yourself. That being at the end of Chapter 4, Goetia gets rescued by her own Skell, the Almandal, and flies off to safety. So, is this a change that's, like, only there for gameplay purposes? So, you get a huge amount of the world unlocked once you have the Skell, and then you get another huge unlock later on with a flight module? Plus, is the existence of the flight module in general a plot hole? Because look at all those Skells doing some really cool acrobatic maneuverings in the opening cutscene, which takes place before the game by 2 years, so shouldn't they be even worse at flying? Well, I'm gonna answer all that stuff, and no, there is no plot hole whatsoever when it comes to the Skell flight module. Just to refresh on the backstory of Skells, all Earth-made models derive from one specific event 30 years prior to the start of the game. Elma arrived on planet Earth, seeking to warn humanity about the encroaching alien threat and give them technology to hopefully combat it. Lyn specifically states that she gave humans 3 different things. The first thing was the precursor to mimeosome technology, the second was Skells, and the third was what she calls light speed travel, but kind of has to be faster than light travel, since the white whale was able to reach Mira in 2 years, and there aren't any stars within 2 light years of the sun, so they must have been going faster than light, but that's beside the point. We're here to talk about the Skells. It's my opinion that Elma probably only brought like 1 Skell with her, because it's also stated that she went to Earth alone, possibly against the wishes of whoever was governing her. That's not specifically clear, but you'd think a peace warning party, hey, there are guys knocking on your doorstep that can probably blow up the planet, here's stuff to help them not do that. You'd think a group sent to do that would be more than 1 person, so I kind of feel like Elma did this of her own volition and wasn't actually sent by anyone, which kind of makes me think she only brought 1 Skell with her. Now, this leads me to the theory where I haven't really seen this from anyone else, but I wouldn't be surprised if other people had thought of this, that the Ares line of Skells, that is, the one Elma was piloting in the opening cutscene, the Prague Ares Lao Steels, as well as the Ares 1790, are ones that are derived directly from that 1 Skell that Elma brought. Of course, the fact that she's the one who pilots the first one we see in the game kind of lends something to that theory. Whereas all the other Earth-made Skells are just ones that were designed to be more mass-producible or just more easily or cheaply produced using the resources and technology Earth has. So if Earth Skells are actually alien in origin, why can't they fly when every other alien Skell can? Well, the first thing to bring up would be the fact that flying on Earth is a really, really difficult thing to actually do. Now, yeah, the flight module isn't completed until you get to Mira, so I guess you could argue that Mira is easier to fly on than Earth, but while it has less gravity, it does still have a pretty strong gravitational pull, and it has an atmosphere, so you still have air resistance to worry about, and those are still the two biggest things that you have to overcome if you want to actually fly now, so I'd argue that similar principles would still be in effect on Mira. Couple that with the fact that Skell designs are really, really not aerodynamic. Now, yeah, when they turn into vehicle mode, those are relatively sleek, and you could probably actually get something that looked like that to go decently fast, but there's no way an actual Skell-shaped thing would be able to fly as fast as they do in reality. Well, the first thing that leads me to think is that all the flight modules we see in-game run on some sort of anti-gravity technology. It only takes one look at one to see that, no, they're clearly not using wings or propellers of any sort, and the amount of exhaust we see just isn't enough for it to be some sort of conventional rocket engine. The fact that you do see some sort of distortion caused by the heat of the flight module does definitely bring jet engines to mind, and while you could just say, yeah, over the however many years it's been, they just created a really good jet engine and Lin was the first one to incorporate it into a Skell correctly, but in my opinion, the amount of distortion we see and the way the flight module looks just doesn't scream engine powerful and efficient enough to lift that big of an object with that little room for fuel to me. It does make me think, though, that if the whole overcoming gravity thing is left to just anti-gravity technology, then the whole propulsion thing and overcoming air resistance, which, yeah, without gravity in the equation, but with air resistance still there, you could probably get away with less aerodynamic looking designs, but I wouldn't hold your breath for actual Skells to be used even if we do ever invent anti-gravity stuff. But a smaller jet engine that only has to work against air resistance, and other than that can just use Newton's third law, more about that later, to the fullest, could probably still work in that situation. So I'm going to just go under the assumption that the flight module we see is anti-gravity plus jet. Still, though, we do have to answer the question of why the Earth Skells didn't have one from the beginning. The obvious explanation for that is the Skell Elma brought as an example just didn't have a flight module on it. Elma doesn't seem to have been an engineer or scientist herself in her past life, back on her home planet or wherever she was. She seems to just have been some sort of military person and a Skell pilot, so if she didn't bring a Skell with a flight module, I can't really fault her for not knowing exactly how one works. She might know, oh, there's anti-gravity tech, this is sort of how it works, and then told it to human scientists who would be better able to actually figure that stuff out, since getting from where we are now to anti-gravity stuff in the 2050s is still kind of impressive in terms of fast progress, so yeah, I'd say an alien kind of nudging us in the right direction would be able to help with that. But why didn't the Skell Elma have a flight module? Believe it or not, I do think I actually have a really good explanation for this, and it comes from that whole opening cutscene thing where you see Skells maneuvering far better than you ever can use them in-game. That seems to contradict the whole no flight module thing, but pay attention to where they are. They're not in the Earth's atmosphere. They're guarding the white whale as it tries to escape the planet. They're in space. So it's my belief that the Skell Elma brought to the humans wasn't one designed for ground or aerial combat, but one designed for use in outer space. See, the cool thing about space is, you know those gravity and air resistance things I keep talking about? Well, they kinda, don't exist when you're up there, so when you're designing a spacecraft, you actually don't need to worry about either of them. Yeah, you've obviously got things like radiation and micrometeoroids hitting you, and, you know, those are kind of a problem, but you don't need aerodynamic design or large fuel capacity. There's no air, so you don't need to make something to cut through it, and, well, the only place we're probably ever going to see giant humanoid robots is in space, so if you want to be a Skell pilot, you should probably start by becoming an astronaut. But anyway, the fuel capacity thing is what brings us back to Newton's third law. You probably know it as for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, but what it really means is that for every force something exerts on something else, that something else will exert the same amount of force back. And if you couple that with the conservation of momentum, then you could sort of see how easy it is to do things in space that you can't do on the ground. Think of it this way. If you're floating off in space, you could just be in orbit, like say you went on a spacewalk outside the International Space Station or something. But for simplicity's sake, just say you're floating out in a void, middle of space, zero gravity. Obviously, all the stars and planets in distant galaxies are exerting some sort of slight pull on you, but for all intents and purposes, you're isolated gravitationally from everything else, so you're just floating there, sitting still. And you got a baseball in your hand. Then you throw that baseball. Now, first off, you're not actually going to be able to throw it as fast as you'd be able to do on the ground, because, well, there's no ground for you to brace yourself on and get in the right stance and throw well, but you will start drifting backwards after you throw that ball. That's because when you put the force into the ball in order to throw it, the ball, as per the third law, pushed back on you by the same amount of force. And then you take into account the law of conservation of momentum, and the fact that you holding the ball was a system with zero momentum, and the amount of momentum the ball has going in one direction must equal the amount of momentum you have going in the opposite direction. Now, momentum is mass times velocity. So that means that the mass of the ball times the speed at which you threw it to is equal to your mass times the speed at which you start drifting back. And if you understood that explanation, well, you pretty much understand the basic principle behind any jet engine that's ever been built. All they do is shoot something out behind them really fast, so the heavier thing that they're actually trying to push is moved in the opposite direction really slowly. When you're on the ground, you need a lot of fuel to push a pretty heavy object because, again, air resistance, gravity. Gravity is a force, and you're gonna have to give an equal and opposite force if you want to sit still in the air, and even more if you want to go up. So, yeah, you're gonna need to shoot a lot of stuff out the back of your engine, so you're gonna need a lot of fuel. But once you're out of the atmosphere, and once you're either at an orbital velocity and are rotating around the planet, or you're just kind of out there, not being pulled too hard in any one direction in the first place, you don't need to shoot as much stuff out the back of your craft in order to move. First off, just look at the thruster engines that spacecraft use to maneuver, and look at how tiny they are compared to the gigantic bells on the bottom of a rocket's first stage. And second off, rockets are huge, but think about the actual amount that, gets into space and isn't just there for lifting that part up to the point where they're in space. Just as an example, here is the Saturn V rocket that took people to the moon. And here is the amount of the Saturn V rocket that actually got there. You probably know that the Saturn V consisted of 3 rocket stages, as well as the command and service module that had the astronauts and the lunar lander at the top. Well, the first stage consisted of 5 Rocketdyne F1 engines, the second stage consisted of 5 Rocketdyne J2 engines, and the third stage consisted of 1 J2. The first and second stages were completely expended just lifting the third stage in the CSM up into orbit, and the third stage was only used for translunar injection, which is basically shooting it out of Earth orbit and towards the moon. The 1 Rocketdyne AJ-10 engine actually on the back of the service module was the main engine besides maneuvering thrusters that was used to control the craft as it went to the moon, to get it into lunar orbit, and then to leave lunar orbit once the whole landing mission was done. Well, in F1, its maximum thrust is 7,770 kilonewtons, A J2's maximum thrust is 1033.1 kilonewtons, and an AJ10's maximum thrust is 43.7 kilonewtons. And this is in a vacuum, so the F1s and J2s on the lower stages were operating at a lot less thrust when they were in the atmosphere. And while, yeah, lower stages did have to accommodate for the fact that they were lifting their own fuel as well as the fuel for the upper stages, this just goes to show how much less power from your engines, as well as just how much less fuel, just judging by the size of the service module compared to the lower stages, you need to maneuver in space. Now, yeah, Skells are doing a lot more complex things and probably would have to have a ton of thrusters all around them, but you can actually see on the backs where the flight module attaches, on the Skells both in space and when a Skell without a flight module jumps, you can see what appear to be small rockets firing. So that really supports this theory that these Skells were designed for space combat. When they're on the ground, they can only get it maybe 1 or 2 Skell heights up, but when they're in space, you can use those as well as other smaller thrusters around the entire thing to maneuver around, zip around at crazy speeds, and do all sorts of ridiculous combat maneuvers that you just straight up couldn't do with the same equipment on the ground. And it took the Skell flight module to get them to even approach that sort of maneuverability down on a planet's surface. I'm not really sure what this video was. It was part theory, part analysis, part physics lecture, part space travel history, and mostly just me gushing about how much I love space and the Xenoblade series. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching as always. If you haven't yet, you should probably click that subscribe button, do the comment thing, follow me on social media, join the Discord server. I don't know, I forget to shout out that stuff a lot of times. Suggest things in the comments or just talk about stuff in the comments. I don't know. But until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.